Good evening, everybody. I stand before you today not as a parent, but as somebody who cares very much about the next generation and somebody who believes in protecting the most vulnerable in our society. And one of the most vulnerable groups, I believe we can all agree, are children and minors, those who are under the age of 18. And I think one of the most helpful things that I can do for you this evening is open up some materials that teachers will have the option of using in the SPHE curriculum in this coming September. And just for those who don't know, SPHE is Social, Personal and Health Education. And so some of these materials are based on a worldview that you might find to be unscientific or contrary to biology or indeed harmful to your children. And I think there's a difference between teaching as informing or warning people or teaching to normalize a particular worldview. And I would put it to you that these material goes into the territory of normalizing this particular worldview. But does it go beyond that? Does it go towards creating a generation of advocates? I leave that question up to you to answer yourselves. Promotion of this worldview is endorsed using terminology such as inclusive, equality, or diversity, and opposition to this worldview is condemned with terms such as bullying, and could it be also defined as hatred? Obviously, I do not stand here before you advocating for bullying or hatred or disrespect, but I think that we need to look beyond those terms and consider whether it is an attempt to silence speech that might be true. And so if we could go to the first slide, my presentation today will be on the basis of these two particular textbooks particularly. So these are for the junior certificate. If you go into ESONs, you should be able to find them there on the shelves. One of them is this one I have here in hard copy, and the other one is an educate.ie textbook, and you can go and find those yourselves. And so if we can go to the next slide, I'd like to take to your attention some teaching on gender, which goes beyond biology and endorses this sort of internal subjective definition of what it is. So it explains that gender identity is how you see and feel about yourself as male, female, both or neither, irrespective of the sex you were assigned at birth. And so if we can go to the next slide. You can see there an image from this particular textbook, and you will see there that there is the gingerbread person, and that definition of gender identity is included there, and it also explains the terms of expression, how you choose to show your gender, and attraction and anatomical sex as well. So if we can go on to the next slide. Another part of this, the materials in that educate.ie textbook includes the normalization of the use of pronouns, so sort of requiring people around you to endorse this particular subjective internal view of gender. And you can see on the screen there, that's an image from the textbook. That's a celebrity called Sam Smith, and I would invite you to research him. But I'm just going to read to you from paragraph 3 of that particular extract, and it explains that addressing people by their preferred pronouns can support their sense of identity and create a more respectful and inclusive environment. Some individuals may feel uncomfortable if their pronouns are not respected, similar to how one might feel if their name is not used correctly. Understanding the importance of pronouns can promote greater empathy and foster positive interactions among people of different gender identities. So really promoting the use of this worldview through kind of modifying the speech of the people around. So if we can move on to the next slide, this is also an extract from that textbook, educate.ie, and you can see that there is an activity there, activity 22.3, and it tells the student to research a famous transgender person, e.g. Elliot Page, or a famous non-binary person, to find information about their life experiences, who supported them and their gender identity, any difficulties they faced as a result of their gender identity, and it instructs the student to create a presentation based on your research and present it to the class. As part of the presentation, give advice for how people can show support to someone who is treated unfairly for the way they express themselves. So basically encouraging the student to become a teacher of this particular philosophy and to stand before their classmates and express that verbally. So if we can move on to the next slide. This again is that same educate.ie textbook. This is an extract from it. And I would put to you that it would include normalization of practices like transitioning surgeries and cross-dressing. So if I can bring your attention to the transition part, it explains that this is a process in which some transgender people begin to live as the gender they identify with rather than the sex registered at birth. They often do this by changing their gender expression, but some people also undergo medical treatments and surgery. This process can also include legal changes. And you can see there at the bottom it gives definitions of the terms gender queer, gender fluid, and third gender. And so it's interesting to just pause for a moment and consider if you were to go onto the NHS website and look up what a transitioning surgery is. Obviously, there's different forms that you can get, but at the most extreme for a woman, it can include the removal of her breasts and her womb, and for a man, the removal of his testes and penis as well. So these are the kind of surgeries that are normalized in some of these materials. So if we can go on to the next slide, normalization of sexual attraction to all genders. So you can see here again the gingerbread person. Again, this is an extract from this particular textbook, and it explains gives various definitions, but it explains a person who is attracted to people of all genders is a pansexual. So various different definitions here normalized in this material. If we can move on to the next slide, something definitely to be aware of is that these materials are obviously influenced by various NGOs who obviously have a particular agenda, and these NGOs are endorsed in the materials. So in this particular textbook that I have, it says these are useful resources and websites. So Belong To is one, which is a national organisation supporting lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex young people in Ireland. There's a Transgender Equality Network in Ireland, and LEN is another one, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network that I saw elsewhere. But these organisations are kind of promoted in the materials as well. So if we can move on to the next slide, just a brief piece of information about material I was able to find that's available for 5th and 6th class. So this is primary school students. And so there's this organization called the NCCA. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, and it's a statutory body of the Department of Education. And basically they have these things called toolkits on their websites. So you can go and they provide material which is supposed to be a support for teachers that they can access. So it's not mandatory material, but it is a material that they can use as resources. And so one of the documents listed on the page for 5th and 6th class is a HSC document called Busy Bodies, and this is a particular extract from that document. So it explains if a person has a deep sense that their gender identity is different from the gender they were given at birth, they may describe themselves as transgender. Some people who are transgender may want to live their lives as boys, some as girls, some somewhere in between, and some as no gender at all. And it goes on to say, if you're questioning your gender identity, talk to a trusted adult in your life, etc. So that's for primary school. So I'd just like to move on a little bit to some more materials in that NCCA website. And I'd really encourage you to go and research about this yourself. Go onto the website and check out the links. But if you go on to this particular website, so they have resources for teaching SPHE or SE. If you can go on to the next slide, there's certain links there for gender identity, etc. And so if you were to click onto that, you'd find a University of Limerick publication that provides help for schools, basically. So if we can go on to the next slide, there's some information about bathroom access. I think you can go on to the next one. So it explains what you can do in terms of bathroom access. So it says, work with trans and gender diverse students to ensure that they have access to a bathroom that aligns with their gender identity. So if we can move on, there's this publication, and I'd encourage you to go and read up on this yourself. It's on gender identity and gender expression in schools. It's an e-resource workbook. So it's University of Limerick and the Transgender Equality Network Ireland. So if you can go on to the next slide. So there's this scale that they provide of visibility in schools. So on one side of the scale, there's good visibility, and on the other, there's hostility to visibility, which is a negative thing. So in the good visibility section, it says there's posters relating to LGBTI plus youth groups. The school takes part in Stand Up Awareness Week. The school displays a pride flag. Now, in contrast to that, in the section on some visibility, a pride flag is displayed for Pride only, which is obviously the month that is celebrated in this country. And then on the other end of the scale, you have hostility to visibility, which says a student who comes out would be in danger of bullying and violence. So obviously, I'm not up here advocating for bullying or violence, but I think that it's necessary to look behind that term of bullying and ask what it means. So if we can go on to the next slide, it explains this definition of bullying. So it gives various scenarios, and you're to pick which is the right one. So scenario one is you overhear students referring to a trans and gender diverse student by their birth name. How would you respond? So you can see at the bottom there's some answers that are given. So you probably can't read it upside down, but the correct answer is B. So this is what you should do. Stop the conversation and inform the students of the student's name, and that to continue calling the student by their birth name is a form of transphobic bullying and will be treated as such. So using the student's name that was given to them by their parents could be falling under this definition of bullying under this particular publication. So we can move on to the next slide. There's more about what is bullying. If we go down to point 3, it gives a scenario. Students make comments on a trans student's social media posts calling them a he or she. So what's the answer? Number 3, yes. Referring to a trans and gender diverse person as a he or she is transphobic. So this is more evidence of bullying. And just quickly to take you to this, if you can go on to the next slide, it's giving advice about how to respond to a young person coming out. And I won't go through it all, but I'll just draw your attention to point number 7, which is, should you immediately contact the student's parents? And the answer is, would not do. Trans and gender diverse youth have a right to privacy. So kind of placing this wedge in between, I suppose, the child and the parent as the school knowing best. So I'm nearly finished, but I suppose I will just briefly make some comments about, I'm sure you're all aware there's certain legislation pending. There's a particular bill, if we can go on to the next page, on incitement to violence or hatred and hate offences. And as I've said before, obviously I don't stand up here advocating for violence or hatred, but obviously this is an attempt to use the criminal law to silence speech. So what is the content of that legislation? Well, Section 7 of that particular, it's not yet enacted, but Section 7 of the bill creates an offence to communicate material to the public that is likely to incite violence or hatred against a person on account of their protected characteristics. So simply inciting hatred is sufficient to qualify as an offence under this proposed legislation. So what are the protected characteristics? Well, one of the protected characteristics is gender, and it's interesting to consider the definition of gender that is provided in the bill. That means the gender of a person or the gender which a person expresses as the person's preferred gender or with which the person identifies, and includes transgender and a gender other than those of male and female. And so this is one of the protected characteristics that it would be possible to incite hatred on. So what does it mean to incite hatred under the legislation? Well, the legislation provides a very helpful definition in Section 2, subsection 1, explaining that hatred means hatred. And so it's quite vague, and obviously that's concerning because it is the criminal law, and the criminal law should have clarity, and it should be clear what conduct is prohibited under that law, considering that you face penal sanctions for breaching that law. And this is particularly concerning because it is a breach of a fundamental human right protected under the Constitution, which is the right to free expression, to freely express your convictions and opinions, along with other rights, of course. Freedom of religion obviously comes into that as well. There is a defence within the proposed legislation under Section 7.3, and so it's basically up to you to prove that the material concerned or the behaviour consisted solely of a reasonable and genuine contribution to various forms of discourse, including religious or political. So what does that mean? It means a contribution considered by a reasonable person to be reasonably necessary or incidental. So basically placing a value system or the power of the man on the street to kind of sit in judgment over speech and just determine whether it's reasonably necessary or incidental to these forms of discourse. So, and the penalties are outlined there, which are pretty substantial on indictment, up to 5 years. There is, you can see on the next slide, there is sort of a nod to freedom of expression in the proposed legislation, but it doesn't provide much comfort because it protects discussion or criticism of matters involving a protected characteristic. So it's unclear what that means, and it certainly doesn't say that it protects speech from the pulpit. And I don't want to take up too much time. I think the materials speak for themselves, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.